I was told by an elder that a skinwalker only wants you to see it when it wants to bother you or make you believe in it. I was raised on a reservation in the Southwest near the Navajo Reservation. And mind you, the Navajo aren't the only ones with the concept of skinwalkers, and there are more than just that tribe. I think that tribe is more associated with the concept of a shaman changing into a wolf or dog. Anyway, our reservation is pretty big land-wise, and at the time, pretty undeveloped. I'm talking about dirt roads, and in spots the houses are a mile or two apart. The yards pretty much only have one guard light, and then it's pitch black out at night. We also had a lot of dogs that roamed the area and lived at various houses. My mom left me with my aunt and uncle so she could go to the casino. Stereotypical, I know. My uncle participated in the Native American church, and that night he hosted a meeting. Meetings consisted of setting up a teepee, and I won't go into much detail, but the women usually tended to cook all night, and then sometimes they participated. It goes pretty much all night, and most often the house is full of people going in and out. Children ran around everywhere, and the older kids helped, but I was pretty young, so I stayed by my aunt. Around midnight, I was trying to sleep, so my older cousin told us to go sleep in the car with her and my younger male cousin. This actually happened often since there were so many people in the house. So I was in the back seat with my cousin and my younger cousin was in the front. It was summer, so we were fine. The guard light was in the front of the house, and we were in the car parked by the side of the house. The teepee was set up in the back with access to the back door. We curled up on the seat, and she pulled the blanket over our heads. I don't remember how my cousin was sleeping in the front, but we did manage to get some sleep in. I think it was only an hour or two later that we heard the dogs barking from near the back of the house. Barking now doesn't bother me, but back then it was an indicator of someone or something coming near the house, and for a long time it used to scare me. Anyway, I felt my cousin waking up near me, and she told me to go back to sleep, but I couldn't, so I laid there listening to the dogs barking. It started to come closer, and it seemed that they were barking at something. The church meeting was in full swing, and when this happens, not much is heard over the chanting and singing. People were also in the house, but not many were awake at the time. So the barking continued to get closer, and at some point we could hear scraping and what sounded like something being dragged. My little cousin in the front asked my older cousin what was going on, and she told him to come lay by us. She said nothing is going on, but cover your head with the blanket. I later learned this trick of playing things off when scary stuff is going down for little kids. She pulled the blanket completely over us and whispered in my ear that no matter what happens or what I hear, I should not open my eyes. The sounds were coming closer to the car now, and I had this horrible feeling come over me. That feeling when your shoulders tighten, and you feel so much fear that you start to shiver as if you're freezing. My little cousin started crying, and said he needed to look out the window. She tried to shush him to keep him quiet, but all that did was start me on crying. She was whispering that at some point, someone would come out and check on us. The dragging sound stopped outside the front window, and whoever it was trying to open the door. It would grasp the door handle and then drop it. It continued to try and try, but after a few minutes, it seemed to give up. Next, we heard the sound of fingernails scratching on the car doors near the ground. The sound continued around the car in a circle. I am unsure of how long this went on, but the meeting took a break and somebody came outside. From what I was told, the sounds of the dogs barking drew them to the car, but they never said what they saw. I eventually passed out, but everyone was freaking out about what had happened, so a lot of smudging occurred and prayers were said. We had to see several medicine men after this happened, and go through a lot of ceremonies, but apparently the meeting had attracted something that wanted to harm one of us kids. I spent a lot of my childhood being scared of the dark and dogs barking at night, but in the end, I was left with a lot of stories about res life, and a stronger connection to myself and who I am. So thank you to the res. So I have never told anyone this story before. I've lurked in this sub for a while, and I thought I would share my experience. As the title suggests, these events took place way back in 1994. My wife and I were separated during this time, and I was frequently traveling between my home with her and where I was living. The night in question, we had a huge argument, and I left to go back to my place. I didn't want to take the interstate, so I often drove through the country. It always seemed to give me the time to think and relax after seeing her and getting so upset. I turned on Mallard Creek Rd sometime around 2:30 in the morning. As I approached the church the road is named for, I realized I had to pee. Like right then. There was a road across the street from the church. It's a dead end with a few houses at the end of it. I turned in and drove perhaps 100 yards and cut off the car. I didn't want anyone to be suspicious of what I was doing. I was just going to walk over to the edge of the woods and pee. As soon as I started, I thought I heard something whisper. I wasn't sure what, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I heard it again. It said, "You don't belong here." At this point, I zipped up while I was still pissing and started stumbling back toward my car. Whatever it was said it again, but much louder than before. "You don't belong here." I was so scared, I ran as fast as I could the last few feet to the car. Whatever was doing the talking or loud whispering did say something else, but I was too busy moving and getting keys out of my pocket, so I couldn't tell you what it said. Those few seconds trying to get into the car and get it started to get the hell out of there seemed like it was in super slow motion. I went back a few days later in the daytime, but there was nothing to see. Just some old woods across the street from an old church. I drove down the road to the end, but there's just a few houses back there. I've long wondered what happened that night. Was someone out there? Did they decide to mess with a stranger that stopped to take a piss? Or did I really not belong there? I was never a religious person, but around the age of 22 I had formed a relationship with a guy that was a Byzantine painter. His job was to create portraits of saints, and was also working in church restoration. It just so happened that back then he was working in a big church on an island, and he was restoring fresco paintings on the walls. I went along to catch a bit of vacation from my work, since it was on a sunny island. And since I wanted to also help him out, I was in charge of climbing up and down the scaffold that we had placed on the walls, and bringing him different tools. The job had to be done at night, since during the day with all the people visiting the church, it was impossible. It was one of those nights while we were working up on the scaffolding that a strange happening took place in the big church. Before I continue, a little bit about the entrance. The entrance had 2 doors. One heavy wooden door several meters high on the outside that had about the thickness of a human body and took 2 people to open and close it. It was locked with a heavy metal lock and a big latch that was on the inside about half the size of a child's arm. The priest would lock the door from the inside and then use a small, normal-sized side door to exit the church. Then after that there was a small hall and a second door with heavy double glass, which would also lock. It had a similar height as the main entrance of the church. During that night, both those doors were locked safely. Now back to the strange happening. At first, we heard a loud banging sound coming from the outside door, and the ground of the inside of the church started to shake, as if a huge earthquake was happening. We were very surprised, and since the original sound came from the entrance, we both turned around to look at what was happening, while holding onto the scaffolding for dear life, because we were several meters up in the air. We saw with our own eyes the heavy outside wooden door pop open, as if it weighed nothing. The force was so strong that it broke the lock. The huge latch that was on top came out of its place and flew into the air, hitting the frame of the glass door, and ended up on the ground. We were left with our jaws hanging open. After the door popped open, there was nothing behind it. Nothing at all. No humans, no bulldozers, no crew of bodybuilders. It was just the dark woods that we could see beyond the door. And then the second sound came. The glass door started shaking, as if a giant was holding it from both sides and was trying to crush it. The door was shaking so violently that it looked like it would come out of its position on the wall and shatter like a glass toy. That went on for several minutes that felt like an eternity, and all that time we were just frozen, looking towards the invisible force that was trying to break down the entrance. But the second door didn't shatter. Instead, as if nothing had ever happened, everything stopped abruptly. Not a single sound was heard after that. We managed to get our shit together and climb down from the scaffolding, leaving everything behind while running toward the side exit. Before leaving, we managed to remember we had to flip the circuit breaker to turn all the lights off, and so we did. We ran toward the room we were given by the priest to sleep in. There were guest rooms they had available for visiting priests, artists working at the church, or people that needed a place to sleep. It was located behind the church and was 2 stories high. When we looked out the window, all the lights were suddenly turned on. Every single one of them. All the windows around the church were emitting a bright light. We had for sure flipped the main switch before exiting. It was right next to the side entrance. Now all the lights were on? That lasted about 10 minutes, and then the church became dark again. At that point, there was no way we could get any sleep. We decided to call the priest at the crack of dawn to arrange a meeting before he headed to the church, so we could tell him what happened. We certainly did not want to get blamed for a broken door. He listened to us silently. Even after we were finished, he did not say a word. He did not blame us for any of this either. He just accepted it all, as if it was a natural thing and he already knew about it. He called a specialized locksmith to repair the damage at the door and the latch. We never received any explanation for any of this, and my now ex-boyfriend stopped working there altogether. To this day, several years later, I haven't got the slightest idea what the hell that was. I was homeschooled when I was younger, and since most homeschooling was done from a Christian perspective, which means we had to study the Old and New Testaments as part of the essential curriculum, I had to spend a lot of time at our local church during the homeschooling fairs, where textbooks were traded, among various other homeschooling groups. My mother was inside the gymnasium where the fair was held, and it being a small town, she was undoubtedly chatting with her cousins. So I was wandering around outside, throwing rocks at the dumpster near a wide field at the edge of the church parking lot. After about the 5th or 6th rock, a kid around my age stepped out from behind that dumpster and started laughing at me, giggling, but in a kind of weird, merry way, almost like a young girl. He had light brown hair, an oval face, and a single freckle in the middle of his forehead. He was wearing white sneakers and a denim jacket. These are the only details I can remember about his attire, though I can remember his face clear as day, and everything that occurred. He walked up to me and asked if I went to the church, and I told him I did. I was 11 at the time, and even now at the age of 34 I can recall each and every kid from my Sunday school back then. I'd definitely never seen him before. I remember asking him if he had met Brother Bruce, our pastor, but he started talking about things in the field he had seen on his way over. Things like rotten pecans on the ground. The field was part of a pecan orchard in central Georgia. Pecan, peanut, and peach fields were everywhere. Our church was right beside one of these massive pecan orchards. He continued talking about random things out there, including toads he'd claimed to have seen, dirt that changed color if you talked to it, and how the birds would follow you around if you walked a certain way. Now, even at that age, I knew fancy kid talk when I heard it, but I didn't doubt that toads would be hopping around a pecan orchard during the day, as the canopy keeps the orchard pretty dim in most places, so the toads sometimes keep an unnatural schedule. Also, if they had a shaker out there recently, a machine mounted on a tractor that literally shakes the pecans out of the trees, there's no telling what critters are crawling around as a result. So I didn't think too much of it all, until he started talking about how one of them, a toad, told him about the dumpster, and that I was nearby. I at this point was still under the assumption that this was just a shy kid who wanted to play. Then he abruptly asked me if I wanted to see some pussy. Yes, I was familiar with the term at that age, but had never seen an adult woman's vagina, so I really didn't know what from what in all truth. I had the typical kid idea of what sex was. This goes there and she gets pregnant, but no solid grasp of the act itself. My life was Nintendo and Ninja Turtles at that time, and that was about as complex as it typically got. But I replied with a curious, okay, and he turned and climbed up the dumpster. Leaning inside, he produced a crumpled magazine and hopped down. He motioned me over so we could be hidden behind the dumpster, by the side facing the field, and proceeded to show me, page after page, some serious hardcore porn. I won't describe the images I saw. Yes, I recall them vividly, but seeing grown men and women like that made me uncomfortable and confused, especially at that age. Even now, as an adult, I can say that was some next-level shit. I looked up from the pages, completely shocked. He was staring at me, and was chewing on his tongue, violently. I said I needed to go back to the parking lot so my mom could see me if she came outside, feeling a panic that we might be caught with that magazine. He immediately folded it and tried to give it to me. He pressed it into my hand and said I could have it. I let it drop and said no as I backed away. He picked it up and said, "You don't want it? I showed it to you." Again I said no and turned to walk away, but spun around when I heard a loud bang against the side of the dumpster. There was a thick trickle of maggot-covered goo seeping from the sliding dumpster door, and he had slammed his hand against it and was gripping the slime between his clenched fist. He was grinding his teeth. He made a gurgling sound in his throat and stretched his mouth wide open. I stood there, still startled from him slamming his hand against the dumpster, and then a slow yellowish stream of thick vomit came out of his mouth and down his chin. I saw several tears running down his cheeks also. His throat made yet another gurgling sound, and he started speaking in a very high-pitched voice, very much like a woman's, talking about the toads in the field again. He repeated,
"Come get them. Come get them,"
over and over, until he was shrieking the words so loud it hurt my ears. His mouth this entire time kept getting wider and wider, wide enough that I could see all of his teeth, and down into his throat, which wasn't a natural color, and had what looked like black strings swirling around. His throat was very vibrant pink, like a bright hot pink. His mouth got even wider. It looked horrible and gruesome. His mouth just kept stretching, and I could hear his jaw popping between his gurgling and screams. His eyes were darting around rapidly. I assumed he had to throw up again, but he just kept screaming and making throat noises, like he was choking on the black strings. I ran to the other side of the dumpster and across the parking lot. Just before I got to the gymnasium doors, I heard him shriek some words. It wasn't just a random cry. He was definitely saying something, but I was running so I couldn't quite make it out. It sounded like,
"You can't throw it away. It's not meant for that."
but I'll never be certain. I went inside and found my mother and told her about the kid. She and my aunt came out, but when I took them to the other side of the dumpster, he was already halfway across the field, still shrieking incomprehensibly. He was prancing. That's the only way I can describe it. And he just kept screaming, stopping at times to stare at us for a moment. Then he would continue. Even from as far away as he was, I could still see that he was stretching his mouth wide open. I was terrified. The magazine was gone, but there were slime streaks where he had trailed his hand through the mess and down the length of the dumpster. The smell of filth was absolutely awful, and little maggots crawled around it in every direction. My mother and aunt called out to him, and even took a few strides into the field, but turned back when he kept prancing and screaming. They immediately started asking me questions. Not wanting to get in trouble, I said we were just standing around, and he started throwing up. They assumed it was from the smell of the dumpster slime. Eventually, they dismissed me, after over an hour of questioning. My mother made the rounds, asking about who had brought their kids, none of which matched his description. After a while, my mom let it go, and I didn't volunteer any further information, least of all about the magazine. I'll never forget that day, nor the kid's horrible face as I ran away from him, his gaping mouth, that horrible gurgling sound, the black strings in his throat, and his wild eyes. It's all forever etched in my memory. I don't have the technical ability to sketch, but I've tried to draw him a few times when retelling the story. It's frustrating that I could never get it right. I never learned his name or anything about him, but I remember it all vividly, particularly his face. I'm 34 now, and I can say with absolute certainty that I was not hysterical or seeing things. Many have suggested that I was suffering from some form of anxiety or having a panic attack as a result of seeing the hardcore porn at such a young age, but I wasn't. I know for a fact I wasn't. I know what I saw was real, and I know that while I was scared shitless, I wasn't the kind of kid to look away from things like that. What I saw was real, and it wasn't natural. Not long ago, July of this year, I was passing through that area and pulled into the church parking lot. There's a new dumpster there, but they put it in the same spot. Where the pecan orchard once was is now a small apartment complex, and beyond it, a new road winding through a developing subdivision. In the south portion, there's now a new city hall. Many of the old pecan trees are still there, though. They were what made me truly uncomfortable. After visiting the church that night, the memories have been especially vivid, and I don't think I can just forget them like I used to, especially his face. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Send your story or creepypasta to the email in the description. My shirts, Patreon, Instagram, and Twitter are down there too. Be good to animals, even people. Sit.
Ja, snämar, bärksbus, hrish.
Which means we had to study. Whoa. My mother was inside the gymnasium. Fuck, the gymnasium.